Hi, I'm Liz Hamson, editor of Property Week, and I'm delighted to be joined today by the inspirational Julie Hirigoyen, Chief Executive of UKGBC, our collaborating partner in the Climate Crisis Challenge campaign. When we launched the campaign back in January, we had no idea that the climate crisis would be far from the only challenge we would be tackling this year. The good news is that, as Julie confidently predicted at the start of lockdown, COVID-19 has not derailed the climate agenda at all. If anything, it has focused the mind and encouraged more companies and investors to double down on it. The extent to which it has shot up the corporate agenda was demonstrated by the phenomenal success of our Climate Crisis Challenge virtual event in June, which around 1,200 people registered for. Despite the ongoing pandemic, momentum continues to build behind the climate agenda and the net zero carbon buildings commitment, thanks in no small part to UKGBC, which recently published the highly influential report Building the Case for Net Zero, a feasibility study into the design, delivery and cost of new net zero carbon buildings. So let's hear from Julie how the property industry is doing. Julie, it's little wonder that more businesses are looking to become carbon zero. Research earlier this year by JLL showed that more sustainable buildings can command rents of 6% to 11% higher than other buildings, and that they also tend to see fewer and shorter void periods. Yet there are still a huge number of companies that have not yet committed to net zero. Why do you think that is? And what's your message to those companies?
Hi Liz, and thanks for that. I think it's really important to distinguish between businesses that have made a sort of organisation-wide commitment to net zero, so they're aiming to deliver net zero emissions by a particular date, and then the net zero carbon buildings themselves. On the organisational front, as you say, there are lots more businesses across all industry sectors, including property and construction, that are signing up to science-based targets and committing to cutting their emissions in line with that 1.5 degree warming, which we're all committed to under the Paris Agreement that we signed up to in 2015. And for those that haven't done that yet, I would say this. The science is really, really clear. IPCC's 1.5 degree report was pretty unambiguous. Any more than 1.5 degree of warming on pre-industrial levels is going to cause absolute havoc to economies and investment portfolios and supply chains and so on. And if we think coronavirus has been bad for business, anything above 1.5 degrees, it is going to be really significant indeed for business survival. So the science is clear. Investors are asking you to do this. Just last week, we saw 137 global financial institutions that hold nearly $20 trillion in assets, calling on, I think it was about 1,800 of the highest emitting companies to set science-based targets. So that's net zero emissions by a particular date. By 2050 at the latest, but hopefully by sooner than that. And they're really sort of pressing on them now. And also peer pressure and customer pressure, right? As more and more companies are doing this, it looks a bit redundant and irrelevant not to be following suit. So there's lots of evidence out there that links strong financial performance to strong climate and other sustainability performance. And I think in terms of how all those firms achieve their net zero goals, that's going to vary from sector to sector, but there are some things that are relevant across all industry sectors for all businesses. Transport, energy procurement and buildings, obviously. We all have some space requirements, whatever our businesses do. So that's where that growing interest in net zero carbon buildings sits. And that, as you say, as the growing demand for those types of buildings builds, those are likely to outperform. There's more and more evidence that those buildings are likely to outperform from both a kind of total returns or a market value perspective, and so on.
But what about those companies that say, look, I'm sorry, but we thought this was important and interesting to us as a business, but we really can't prioritise this right now. We've got to simply get through this whole COVID crisis and survive. What's your message to those companies?
I think it's really challenging because they're required to look long term as well as short term, and that the danger is that short term sort of desperate survival sort of instinct is going to damage their long term prospects. And most businesses will know that their customer base, their investor base, their peers are going in this direction regardless. So it's not an either or. I think it has to be both and. Both surviving this COVID crisis and making strides towards addressing one's emissions. And actually, I think, as you mentioned in your intro, quite rightly, many businesses are now recognising sort of some of the links and similarities between the two, and are quite spooked, if I can put it like that, by the sheer kind of chaos and havoc caused by something that has come so left field. So I think, that it's been said many times, but there is no vaccine against climate change. This is a systemic long-term risk that's coming thick and fast.
And there's a lot of value, isn't there, in the concept of the green recovery and really dovetailing the two agendas.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, indeed, one could argue, given the pandemic and the sort of economic crisis that we're in, unless we use this opportunity to absolutely transform and reshape our economic growth models and our sort of investment assumptions, we won't make it to 1.5 degrees in time. We won't cut our emissions fast enough to achieve that level of warming. And then
so it's not so much a golden opportunity, it's a green opportunity that we've got here that's been presented by COVID. To embed ESG principles throughout your business requires strong leadership and a very top-down approach. Looking ahead to COP26, which is now in November 2021, can you share with us some of the key messages from Nigel Topping, who is the government-appointed climate action champion for COP26 and spoke at one of your recent events?
Yes, absolutely. So the event that you mentioned was an exclusive event for business leaders in our membership community. We've got a leaders network, which is made up of 160 or so chief executives, C-suite execs from firms right across the property value chain, and we convene them together to hear from high-profile speakers on critical issues we think are important for them to know about. And so the event where we invited Nigel Topping, who is the high-level climate action champion for COP26, took place during World Green Building Week. And he spoke to these leaders and told them in no uncertain terms, really, what success and failure would look like for COP26 next year. So he started really by positioning climate change as a real failure of traditional risk management sort of practices in terms of both the severity and the likelihood of this as a risk increasing exponentially outside of our sort of realms of control and understanding. And then he emphasised really the growing concern that scientists and the scientific community feel, as all those past predictions of climate change are materialising much faster and much more severely than anticipated. But he also spoke of the anger and fear that's felt particularly by younger generations and our future workforces as they reflect on both the kind of political apathy of the last sort of 2, 3, 4 decades where we've had this on the table but not done much about it, and as they contemplate a future that's pretty bleak and uncertain in the context of runaway climate change anyway. And he explained to us all why COP26 is such an important moment in time and a milestone. So the Paris Agreement that was reached in 2015 was really the first time we secured kind of worldwide buy-in to ultimately reduce global emissions to something close to 1.5 degrees. But the reality is that the sum of all of the national ambitions, what are called NDCs, nationally determined contributions, all of those emissions reductions targets would take us to somewhere above 3 degrees. So the really important bit of COP26, which is the first conference since that Paris Agreement was reached, the first 5-year milestone, is that it should reinforce the process that was agreed in Paris, and lots of countries around the world need to submit ratcheted up ambitions, so more stretching net zero targets, more rapid decarbonisation trajectories. And in order to give governments the confidence to do that, they really need non-state actors, which is where Nigel's role comes in effectively, to stimulate ambition and commitment from businesses, from regions and cities and states around the world to net zero. And he talked about it as this sort of ambition loop where the public and private sector need each other to actually drive, the confidence on both sides, which was really interesting. So he was really warm and welcoming of some of the work that we're doing at UKGBC to try and connect that public and private sector level of ambition and to drive up commitments from businesses, but also to create stronger partnerships between public and private sector on net zero carbon buildings in particular.
And how confident was he that we could achieve this ambition loop and that could become a reality rather than sort of an impressive concept?
I think where, the hope is that sectors will self-organise in the same way as we're trying to kind of galvanise the built environment sector to do here in the UK, to actually collaborate across sector and to put to government sort of, trajectories for decarbonisation that then link with other sectors. And none of this is sort of can be done in silos. So he's hopeful when he was hopeful when he was reflecting on some of the things that we're trying to do, that actually that's the sort of work, those are the sorts of initiatives that will enable that collective buy-in and collective collaboration around common goals. And the more of those types of initiatives we have where sectors have roadmaps or commitments that they all signed up to, the easier it is for government to support that, to endorse it, to introduce policies that enable that to happen, and to sort of bring up the level playing field, as it were. But without any of that, the noise and the sort of sort of slight chaotic nature of it means that we're not all pulling in the same direction.
Yeah, and I suppose COP26 is going to be a really critical moment, isn't it, where we can evaluate really what's been achieved, and whether COVID has accelerated, as some people think it has, the agenda, or perhaps been something of a roadblock. As we reported recently in Property Week, you've also just appointed a new chairman, the architect Sunand Prasad. Now, he pulled no punches when he said on his appointment, the business case for sustainability has been made. If you don't act on the climate crisis, you will be outpaced by your competitors, abandoned by your investors, and unprepared for the physical impacts of climate change. What's at the top of his to-do list at the moment, and at what, in your own words, is a critical point in the journey?
Sure. I mean, firstly, just to say it's a real pleasure to welcome Sunand as our new chair. He's been a trustee for some time. He brings real gravitas and profile, extensive experience in his past role as president of REBA, but also, really recognised as a voice on sustainability in the industry, and a strong political profile as well. So his and actually interestingly, he has a real specialism in community projects like hospitals and care homes, which is particularly pertinent at this point in time. But Sunand's really keen to use his position as chair of UKGBC to really continue championing action, climate action in particular. He's really passionate about the role that we as an organisation can play in disseminating practical solutions and know-how to really accelerate the take-up of net zero carbon across the industry. So he wants UKGBC to become that go-to organisation for anyone that's trying to understand, well, how do I practically do it? How do I deliver net zero carbon on my building, on my scheme, on my asset portfolio, or what have you? And he's also pledged to make it his personal mission to increase the diversity of individuals around the table when discussions are being had around sustainability in the built environment. And as you probably know, the sustainability sector in itself is relatively undiverse, and the sustainable built environment sort of discussions often happen in a bit of a bubble. So that's also one of his key aspirations.
And what does he think that diversity piece will bring to the table then? What does he think? How is it going to change the debate?
So I think as we're increasingly talking about things like, how do development buildings or the built environment generate social value, which is obviously, very high on the sort of awareness and on the agenda at the moment, social value and sort of socioeconomic well-being, particularly as the pandemic continues to hit the economy. We can't exclude all of the different voices that are impacted on by their local neighbourhood, their local environment, their local built environment, and the way in which, even just simple things like space standards or, so many things have come into sharp focus through COVID and through the lockdown that point to how our built environment is actually failing us in some circumstances and situations. And we need to be as inclusive and broad in our recognition of what that feels like to different cultures, to different genders, to different typologies, and as we can. Otherwise, we're not necessarily sort of speaking for for the voice of all people. So it's really, really important that we don't sort of leave anyone behind in that respect, and that we're as broad and inclusive as we can be.
I think it's a critical. I think diversity is critical to this, actually, to progressing the agenda, because otherwise you are preaching to the converted, or you continue to preach to the converted, and it's in broadening this out that you start to move away from that echo chamber, I suppose, way of doing things. What's coming up in your Advancing Net Zero programme in terms of next projects and initiatives?
So you mentioned, Liz, in your intro, the piece of work that we did most recently under the Net Zero programme, which was a cost evaluation study, really looking to illustrate how new buildings in particular, and we looked specifically at offices and residential, can be designed to reach net zero carbon standards, both 2025 and 2030, and we looked at the impact of that on both designs themselves and on capital costs. That sort of work is absolutely crucial. It almost links to the points that I was making around Sunan's own passion and interest in, we need to get to the point where we're talking about how do you do it. And so we will be doing lots more of those types of studies, hopefully going forwards. We have an accompanying report that will that has a lot of the market transformation sort of barriers, challenges and opportunities around how one organises oneself to overcome some of those barriers and challenges that sort of fell out from that report. So that's coming up shortly. We're also working with the NHS England on specific standards for NHS hospitals and various other big aspirations for different asset types to actually develop different types of standards for net zero carbon building typologies, if I can call it that. And we're also publishing before the end of the year guidance on renewables procurement, but also on offsetting, which of course at the moment, to get to a fully net zero outcome, both of those are important components. So there's quite a lot upcoming, just even before the end of the FY.
Yeah, that's quite a full agenda that you've got there for the next few months. And what are your hopes, fears and expectations for the coming year? And what sort of progress would you like to see the industry make by COP26 next November?
So I suppose my hope would be that we look back on 2020 in a few years' time as the year that emissions, the first year, effectively, that emissions started to drop globally. My fear is that this desire and desperate need to boost short-term economic growth, it will mean that we're not investing enough in green recovery measures, and that we're returning to sort of fossil fuel heavy reliant investments, and therefore that our emissions won't have peaked in this year, or at least that the reductions caused by the pandemic won't be sustained in future years. So those would be my fears. In terms of what I would like to see us achieve by COP26, and there are two big projects that, or initiatives really, that I would like in the UK us to see real traction on. The first is a net zero whole life carbon roadmap, which we at UKGBC are looking to collaborate with a multitude of other organisations, including, importantly and critically, government, in order to ensure that we're really clear as to what needs to happen by when, by different bits of the sector, including product manufacturers, and just tackling the embodied piece. And we have a very clear roadmap of where we need to get to by when, and we're then all of those organisational commitments can actually sort of help us along that journey and drive in the same direction. So that's a really important piece, and we hope to have come up with that by the time and launch it effectively at COP26 next year, with buy-in from the industry and from government and multitudes of stakeholders. The other is more and more businesses signing up to the Net Zero Carbon Buildings commitment, which is the World Green Building Council commitment around net zero carbon buildings. And if we have enough organisations, and particularly non-built environment organisations, signing up to that commitment, then you really start to create that market pull and market demand for the sector to deliver net zero carbon buildings, because customers and occupiers are asking for them. So I think both of those things, one being the sort of big picture, where do we need to get to by when, and real clarity on that, and real consensus between government and business or industry, and the other being, hundreds if not thousands of signatories to this net zero carbon buildings commitment will demonstrate that the built environment is really ready to play its part, at least in the UK.
It's interesting that you talk about going beyond the built environment, though, and I think that's a critical part again of your ambition loop, isn't it? Really, to get that buy-in right across the piece. Listen, thanks ever so much for sharing your insights, Julie. It's great to hear how much progress that the industry is making. There's clearly a long way still to go, hence our campaign. To find out more about the Climate Crisis Challenge and how you can be part of the solution, not the problem, do get in contact with UKGBC or Property Week. We're looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you.